We're approaching the fourth year of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a special military operation that Russia expected to last 10 days at most. Instead, it's transformed into one of the most consequential conflicts of the 21st century, and both sides now face unprecedented challenges that go far beyond the battlefield itself. Ukraine continues to rely on a combination of Western military aid, innovative domestic production, and the resilience of its population. Russia, meanwhile, has transformed into a war economy under President Vladimir Putin's leadership, bleeding personnel and equipment at unsustainable rates while facing mounting internal isolation. But the complexity of this conflict extends far beyond the trenches of Donbass or the skies over Kyiv. It's fundamentally reshaped global alliances and created ripples throughout the rest of the world. With 2026 and the fifth year of the conflict on the horizon, military analysts, intelligence agencies, and policy experts have mapped out 7 distinct scenarios for how this conflict could evolve. So let's see how it all might play out percentage-wise. Scenario 1. The conflict spills into multiple regional wars. 20% probability. Moscow maintains a vast network of geopolitical relationships that could be weaponized to stretch NATO resources thin and force the West to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. In the Middle East, Russia has been a major military equipment supplier to Iran and previously to Syria. Iran is now directly involved in conflicts across the region, and Russia is receiving Iranian drones for use in Ukraine. Any escalation in the Middle East, particularly involving Israel, could force the US to divert more military resources and attention away from Europe. The Indo-Pacific theatre presents an even more concerning possibility. China has been Russia's economic lifeline throughout the war, helping Moscow bypass sanctions through increased trade and alternative payment systems. North Korea has gone a step further, directly supplying Russia with artillery shells and even troops. If China were to take aggressive action toward Taiwan, while Russia intensifies operations in Ukraine, we could see a true world war. And China has been closely watching how the war in Ukraine has progressed in terms of international relations and is unlikely to make the same mistakes. Russia also maintains influence within NATO itself. Turkey has frequently played both sides, refusing to implement all Western sanctions while maintaining dialogue with Moscow and temporarily delaying Sweden's accession to the alliance. Hungary has repeatedly blocked or delayed EU aid packages to Ukraine. Both countries have deep economic ties to Russia that create leverage points for the Kremlin, with similarly authoritarian governments that have been accused of corruption on multiple fronts. The Western Balkans could also spark a hybrid conflict between the Russia-China axis and NATO. Serbia's relationship with Russia, combined with ongoing tensions in Kosovo and Bosnia-Herzegovina, creates opportunities for Moscow to destabilize Europe's southeastern flank. These countries are historically dependent on foreign energy and investment, giving Putin tools to create crises that would demand NATO's attention. The EU has historically had a lot of difficulties trying to bridge the gap between its west and east, with the Balkans being geographically and infrastructurally important to conducting cross-European trade. China has also become a large investor in Balkan infrastructure projects, which infringes upon the EU's ability to direct and influence regional geopolitics through continued investment. If things go south, we might see Russia spurring conflict in any one of these regions, whether directly or indirectly. This builds on Russia's documented strategy of hybrid warfare, a combination of military force, economic pressure, cyber operations, disinformation, and proxy conflicts to achieve strategic objectives. This strategy could allow Russia to make territorial gains in eastern Ukraine while the West is distracted. It could also fracture the unity that's characterized NATO's response so far, as different member states prioritize different threats based on their geographic position and interests. However, the unintended consequences could be catastrophic for Russia. Triggering multiple regional conflicts could unite the West even more firmly against Moscow. China might not appreciate being dragged into Russia's timeline for conflict, as it spent decades trying to bridge the gap between itself and the US military and is still not there. Scenario 2. The war continues with attrition. 12% probability. In this scenario, 2026 looks remarkably similar to 2025, just more exhausted and more dependent on external support. Both sides have accepted that neither can achieve a decisive victory in the near term, so the war becomes a test of industrial capacity, international backing, and domestic will. The battlefield itself would become increasingly static, as both sides would control roughly the same territory they held in late 2025, with the same marginal gains and losses measured in villages rather than cities. And following the trend seen from 2024 and 2025, news reports would increasingly focus on the very minute or the big picture, as there'd be practically no large-scale operations to speak of. In all likelihood, Russia wouldn't be able to sustain summer invasions that were the hallmarks of 2024 and 2025, when tens of thousands died and the front shifted by miles a day. Ukraine wouldn't be able to repeat the August 2024 Kursk invasion, just sporadic incursions into Russia's airspace or infrastructure sabotage. The mechanics of this scenario favour Russia in some ways and Ukraine in others. Russia's larger population and industrial base should provide advantages in a pure attrition contest. Moscow can theoretically continue producing tanks, artillery, and ammunition indefinitely, even if those are of the older variety used in the latter stages of the Cold War, rather than brand new T-90s. But even existing Soviet stocks are being depleted far faster than domestic production can replace them. Once these stocks are exhausted, potentially by mid-2026 according to some accounts, Russia's ability to conduct mechanized warfare degrades sharply. Ukraine's advantages lie in technology and adaptability. Ukrainian forces have proven far more capable of integrating new systems, adjusting tactics, and innovating on the battlefield. The proliferation of drones means that the greatest risk is for disposable, easy-to-produce equipment rather than infantry or large vehicles. If Ukraine can maintain its technological edge while scaling up domestic production, it can potentially bleed Russia at a favourable exchange rate. But there's still a significant demographic cost of continuing attrition. Ukraine's population has been drastically reduced by casualties, refugees, and territorial losses, and the military has needed to increase conscription limits multiple times. Russia's economy depends on having a healthy population to work in the energy and military-industrial complex, but it can't do that if it's actively recruiting year-round. For Ukraine, a grinding stalemate that prevents Russia territorial gains while Western aid continues is better than defeat or capitulation. The hope would be that Russia's economy eventually collapses under the strain, forcing Moscow to negotiate. For Russia, this scenario would signal that Putin failed to deliver on his initial objectives, but still avoids using the term defeat directly. Putin's regime can claim to be defending Russian interests so long as Ukraine doesn't want to fold over. Scenario 3. Russian breakthrough as Moscow exploits reduced US support. 4% probability. This scenario suggests that American support for Ukraine wavers at a critical moment, and Russia seizes the opportunity to achieve the breakthrough that has eluded it for 3 years. The triggering factor would likely be internal US politics. President Donald Trump's public statements about wanting to end the war immediately, and his administration's temporary suspension of intelligence sharing with Ukraine in early 2025 showed that the US might want to end the war regardless of the winning side. If the US considers its own interests, such as the rapidly changing trade war with China, it might decide to suspend support for Ukraine again to bring it back to the negotiating table. Without American intelligence, particularly satellite surveillance and signal intercepts, Ukraine's ability to anticipate and counter Russian operations plummets. Simultaneously, Russia could mobilize whatever resources it has left for one concentrated push. The target would likely be a critical logistics hub in Donbass, such as Pokrovsk, which Russia has been trying to capture for over a year, or Kramatorsk, which serves as a major Ukrainian command center. From there, Russia could finally occupy Donbass and move to the rest of the country, as Ukraine loses momentum and drive to defend itself. And even a limited victory that occupies only Donbass demonstrates that Ukraine can't sustain itself without full American backing. It wouldn't matter how much other NATO countries actually provide, so long as the propaganda shows that Ukraine's failures stem directly from America's lack of active involvement. However, this scenario is also incredibly risky. The offensive could consume remaining strategic reserves, leaving Russia even more depleted than before. Russia could lose tens of thousands of troops and hundreds of vehicles and other equipment in a matter of weeks. If the offensive fails to achieve an actual breakthrough, Russia's bargaining position worsens significantly, because everyone can see that even with reduced Ukrainian support, Russia still couldn't prevail. This scenario is also less likely due to the rest of NATO. European members of the coalition of the willing have demonstrated willingness and capability to compensate when the US suspended its support. France, Britain, Germany and Poland have all increased their support commitments. For example, Ukraine still has French planes and a large number of German and Polish military vehicles that require less direct support from US intelligence. Ukraine's satellite intelligence is also partially provided by independent parties rather than governments. A Russian breakthrough might even trigger European military invention discussions that have been taboo until now. France and Britain have hinted at possible boots-on-the-ground scenarios if a Russian victory appeared imminent. This could escalate the conflict into a direct NATO-Russian confrontation that neither side wants. For the United States, this would only validate critics who argue that halfway support for Ukraine was the worst possible option. If Russia wins on this front, chances are it will just continue on to the next target, be it in the Caucasus, the Balkans, or even Finland or the Baltics. Then the US would still need to provide direct support, this time actually bound by Article 5 of NATO. Scenario 4. Permanent stalemate. 38% probability. The most likely scenario is that the war doesn't end, but it doesn't really continue either. Instead, the Russia-Ukraine conflict could transform into something resembling the Korean Peninsula, an indefinite frozen conflict. This is because both sides have depleted their most capable units, expended their best equipment, and exhausted their morale for continued conflict. Russia would likely shift from offensive operations to setting up more defences. It would fortify its positions in occupied Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblasts, declaring these territories liberated and focusing on integrating them administratively into the Russian Federation. Attacks could continue, but they would be primarily artillery exchanges, drone strikes and small-scale raids rather than battalion-level assaults. The critical factor heralding this scenario is Russia's depletion of mechanized warfare capability. Analysis suggests that by the end of 2026, Russia might expend most of its Soviet-era tanks and armored vehicles. Domestic production can't replace these losses at anywhere near the rate they're being destroyed, and infantry attacks without tank and vehicle support have been shown to be devastatingly ineffective in making ground. Ukraine has been able to stave off even larger mechanized infantry attacks involving dozens of tanks and IFVs at once. Just using human troops would be tantamount to placing targets on a shooting range for Ukrainian drones. Similarly, Ukraine could maintain pressure through drone strikes, artillery bombardment, and limited counter-offensive operations, but would likely need to downscale ambitions of recovering Donbass. The focus would shift to making occupation costs as high as possible for Russia, while building Ukraine's defensive and economic capacity for the long term. Once again, the key here is Ukraine's drone technology. These systems are cheap to produce, difficult to defend against, and can be operated with minimal training. They allow Ukraine to inflict continuing casualties on Russian forces without risking Ukrainian personnel or expensive equipment. The combat in this frozen state will look both very different and similar to what we've seen between 2022 and 2025. Both sides would launch dozens or hundreds of small drones daily, targeting enemy positions, supply depots and personnel. Occasionally, larger strikes with missiles or long-range drones would hit strategic targets. Artillery would exchange fire across the line. Special operations forces would conduct raids, but none of this would significantly change territorial control or the shape of the front line. Neither Ukraine nor Russia wants this scenario to happen. For one, Ukraine would likely need to accept the fact that it could lose 20% of its territory to Russia and be forced to continue drone production and NATO donations for years. Russia would keep claiming that it has defended Russian interests, stopped Ukraine from moving toward NATO, and liberated parts of Ukraine from the so-called neo-fascist movement. At the same time, its economy would likely remain stilted by Western sanctions and increasingly dependent on China as a major export partner, to the point that it can dictate future policies. The demographic crisis for both countries would only get worse, with military-industrial complexes firing on all cylinders to replenish military supplies and create new sources of income. At the same time, whatever casualty does occur would further reduce the number of working people. Perhaps most concerning, this scenario offers no mechanism for eventual resolution. Putin's regime has grown to practically needing an exterior force to keep propaganda focused on something other than domestic issues. Ukraine society has solidified its stance on independence to the point where any further concessions to Russia would be deemed unacceptable. At that point, we might see something happen in 2027 or in 2037. Scenario 5. Ukraine pressured into compromise, 11% probability. In this scenario, Ukraine might be pressured, both internally and externally, to the point where it must accept terms that favour Russia, even if the latter doesn't achieve a full victory, occupation, or integration. The process would likely begin with sustained American pressure on Kyiv to negotiate. The US administration, frustrated by the war's duration and cost, could make continued support contingent on the Ukrainian willingness to compromise. European members of the coalition of the willing might initially resist, but could be forced to align with the US. For this, Russia would need to maintain just enough military pressure to negotiate from a position of relative strength. This doesn't require major territorial gains, just a notion that it could continue pressuring Ukraine. Even a vital target such as Pokros could be enough to turn the tide when combined with lowered Western support. As usual, Putin would likely approach the topic by suggesting peace, then completely declining any attempts to conduct actual diplomacy, sticking to his original claims. The worst part is that this is an entirely credible scenario because Ukraine so far has truly needed Western support for maintaining defences. If those systems falter in any way, Ukraine will ultimately be forced to approach negotiations from a position of weakness, even if the current situation on the front indicates a stalemate. Ukraine would need to cede portions of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts currently under Russian control, which might be formalized as autonomous regions or transferred to Russia outright. But more painfully for long-term geopolitics, Ukraine would likely be completely prohibited from NATO ascension, and even EU integration could be up for debate. In exchange, Ukraine is likely to receive some limited security guarantees, probably from a subset of NATO countries rather than the alliance as a whole. These guarantees will be deliberately ambiguous, offering more than nothing but less than Article 5 protection. Russia would agree to a ceasefire along current lines, with a demilitarized zone monitored by international observers. Sanctions relief for Russia would begin gradually, contingent on Russia not resuming hostilities. However, Ukraine would never genuinely accept these terms, and Russia would never trust that Ukraine wouldn't try to reverse them. Both sides would spend the peace preparing for the next round of fighting. The ceasefire would be a pause, not a resolution. If Ukraine doesn't receive security guarantees, Russia would just power up the war machine in a few years and try to go for the kill. This would set up a dangerous precedent for the rest of the world, where NATO could be seen as continuously degrading and unable to significantly influence the foreign policies of even the countries that are historically most dependent on it. Emboldened by Russia's victory, China might decide to try its hand by invading Taiwan, which would plunge the world into an even bigger conflict through a cascade of alliances triggering defense agreements. Scenario 6. Mutually unsatisfactory ceasefire. 12% probability. This scenario represents the outcome nobody wants, but everyone might get. A ceasefire that satisfies no one, resolves nothing, but stops the dying temporarily. The trigger on one side could be economic collapse in Russia, reaching a critical threshold where maintaining offensive operations becomes literally impossible. This can come from the energy industry's production degradation, up to 20% in 2025, combined with lower oil and gas exports and increased costs, coupled with the fact that Russia's military sales collapsed by as much as 92% between 2021 and 2024. On the other side, Ukraine would be facing its own crisis. If NATO can't agree on what level of support is enough, increasing military spending domestically could mean trying to cut donation funding or streamlining military equipment to the point that they're effective at just purely holding the line rather than making progress. Considering that Ukraine is actively spending more than 25% of its GDP on the military, its economy simply can't function without NATO at present. Neither side would formally agree to negotiations. Instead, military operations would gradually de-escalate until a de facto ceasefire emerges without anyone officially declaring one. The front would just slowly cement itself as a grey zone that no one controls. The critical difference between this scenario and Scenario 4, frozen conflict, is the absence of security guarantees for Ukraine. In a frozen conflict scenario, Ukraine would ideally have some form of security arrangement. This could be enhanced NATO partnership, bilateral defense agreements with major powers, or at a minimum, a clear line that triggers an international response if crossed. In this scenario, Ukraine has none of that. The grey zone exists without an international framework, leaving Ukraine perpetually vulnerable. This still leaves a similar option as in the previous scenario, where Russia could bide its time until it attacks again. NATO would ultimately likely agree to maintain some modicum of security, but the big part of this scenario is that NATO countries themselves would see military investments rise. This alone could be enough to dissuade Russia from making any overtly offensive movements against the alliance or even Ukraine itself. Scenario 7. Ukrainian victory, 2% probability. This is the scenario that most people are hoping for, but ultimately the one least likely to happen. Ukraine winning simply requires an almost perfect alignment of international support, military success, and Russian collapse that seems increasingly unlikely but remains theoretically possible. It would start with a dramatic shift in US policy. The US could think that Chinese aggression toward Taiwan becomes more likely if Russia succeeds in Ukraine, or a calculation that Russian defeat now prevents more costly conflicts later. Whatever the trigger, the United States would move from measured support to overwhelming commitment. This would mean lifting all restrictions on weapon systems, including sending long-range missiles such as Tomahawks with ranges sufficient to strike deep into Russian territory. On Europe's side, newer weapons being sent to Ukraine could show Russia just how deficient it would be if it decides to push the envelope further. At the same time, NATO member states tightening its economic and geopolitical sanctions against Russia would mean most of the world would simply stop trading with it, which would threaten complete collapse. For Ukraine to achieve a decisive victory, China would also need to stop supporting Russia. This could happen through American diplomatic and economic pressure, with the US threatening more tariffs, technology restrictions, and financial consequences if China continues enabling Russian aggression. If China realizes that a continuing relationship with Russia has become more costly, or threatens to spill out in a protracted China-NATO conflict that it can't win, it might pull the plug on supporting Russia in evading sanctions. Ukraine would also need to score significant frontline and long-range strike victories in 2026 to accelerate this. Something large, like another Kharkiv counter-offensive, combined with a new incursion into Russia, could lead to more momentum and deteriorate Russia's standing. Internally, the Russian government would have to fail one way or another. Perhaps the deepening economic crisis will lead Putin being ousted. Maybe Putin dies from natural or unnatural causes. Maybe Russia experiences a widespread revolution that paralyzes the military. Even then, Putin would need to be dissuaded from using the nuclear weapon trump card he's threatened with every single time NATO tried to provide more assistance to Ukraine. The problem is that every single element failing here makes the scenario dramatically less likely. Meanwhile, the last point about nuclear war alone is something that's been keeping NATO in check since February 2022. Considering how most of the scenarios point to continuing conflict, 2026 is likely going to be the year everyone accepts that the war in Ukraine won't end soon and begins adapting to that reality. Thanks for watching. Now, if you want to check out a detailed overview of why Russia could lose the war from internal pressure, check out our video on Russia's collapse. Or, to stay up to date with the most recent developments that sway how likely each scenario is, subscribe to the Military Show for daily videos.